You're looking at a country that got hit with two atomic bombs, major cities reduced to rubble, millions of people lost, the entire economy obliterated. The year's 1945, and Japan is like basically a smoking crater. The average Japanese citizen is eating whatever they can scavenge. Inflation is running wild. The country's industrial output has collapsed to basically nothing. Foreign experts are literally writing Japan off as a permanent basket case. They're saying it'll need decades of charity just to survive. Now, fast forward exactly 30 years to 1975. This same country, the one that was literally radioactive ash 3 decades earlier, it's become the second largest economy on the entire planet. They're building cars that Americans can't stop buying. They're manufacturing electronics that are taking over the world. Their GDP has grown by something like 1,000%. Japanese companies are becoming household names in every country on earth. How does that even happen? How does a nation go from atomic devastation to economic superpower in the time it takes most people to pay off a mortgage? And here's the question that should really be keeping you up at night. What did Japan figure out about building wealth that most people, and honestly, most countries, still haven't learned? My name is Max, and I spend way too much time thinking about how economies actually build wealth from nothing, and why some people in some nations figure out the wealth building game while others stay stuck in the same financial patterns for generations. If you're someone who's ever wondered why some people seem to escape financial hardship while others stay trapped, or if you've ever felt like the economic deck is stacked against you, hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up, because today we're breaking down the most incredible economic transformation in modern history and extracting the wealth building principles that actually work. Here's what most people don't realize about Japan's situation in 1945. They weren't just poor, they were starting from negative. Now, think about that for a second. Most of us, when we think about building wealth, we're starting from zero. Maybe we have some debt, but we have functioning infrastructure, we have education, we have skills. Japan had none of that. Their factories were bombed out. Their transportation networks were destroyed. Their major cities were flattened. They had literally nothing except people who were willing to work. Now, you might be thinking, this is ancient history. Why should I care about post-war Japan? Here's why this matters to you personally. Japan figured out something about wealth creation that most financial advisors won't tell you. Why? Because it doesn't sell courses or coaching programs. They discovered that the traditional rules of building wealth, the ones that say you need capital to make capital, are actually backwards. The conventional wisdom says you need money to make money. You need resources to build resources. You need wealth to create wealth. Japan proved that's completely wrong. They started with nothing but human capital and turned it into the second largest economy in the world in a single generation. Let me walk you through exactly how they did it, because the principles here are going to change how you think about your own financial situation. The first thing Japan figured out was something I call strategic investment in human capital. Now, before you tune out thinking this sounds like corporate buzzword nonsense, let me show you what this actually meant in practice. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Japan was broke. They couldn't afford to rebuild factories. They couldn't afford to import raw materials. They couldn't afford basically anything. But here's what they could do. They could invest in education. They could train their workforce. They could develop skills that would become valuable later. The Japanese government, despite being essentially bankrupt, prioritized education spending at levels that seemed insane given their situation. By the early 1950s, Japan was spending a higher percentage of its GDP on education than most wealthy Western nations. They were betting everything on the idea that educated, skilled workers would eventually generate returns that would dwarf any short-term savings from cutting education budgets. Here's the thing that makes this so psychologically interesting. When you're broke, your instinct is to cut everything. You go into survival mode. You eliminate all non essential spending. Japan did the opposite. They said education isn't a luxury we'll add when we can afford it. Education is the investment that will make us able to afford everything else. This is where it gets really interesting for your personal finances. Most people treat education and skill development the same way broke countries treat it. They say, I'll invest in learning new skills when I have more money, when I have more time, when I'm more stable. But Japan proved that the investment in human capital is what creates the stability, not the other way around. The math here is brutal and illuminating. Japan's literacy rate, which was already relatively high, jumped to essentially 100% by the 1960s. Their workforce became one of the most educated on the planet, and here's the payoff. Educated workers produce more value per hour worked. They innovate more. They solve problems more efficiently. They create wealth faster. The average Japanese worker's productivity increased by something like 8% annually during the miracle years. That's not 8% total, that's 8% compound growth year after year. If your income grew 8% annually for 30 years, you'd be making almost 10 times what you started with. That's the power of investing in your earning capacity. But education alone doesn't explain the Japanese miracle. The second principle they figured out, economists call it export led growth, but I'm going to call it what it really is. They mastered the art of creating value for others first. Here's what I mean. Japan in the 1950s couldn't afford to consume much. Their domestic market was tiny because everyone was poor. So instead of trying to build an economy by selling to themselves, they focused obsessively on creating products that other countries would want to buy. This required a fundamental psychological shift that most people in most countries struggle with. Instead of asking, "What do we want?" they asked, "What does the world need that we can provide?" Instead of building for their own consumption, they built for export. Instead of spending their limited resources on lifestyle improvements, they channeled everything into creating things that would generate income from outside their system. Now, translate this to personal finance, because this is where the insight gets powerful. Most people think about money as something they earn, so they can spend. They get a paycheck, they spend the paycheck, they repeat. Japan flipped this thinking. They thought about creating value first, capturing some of that value as income, and then reinvesting that income to create even more value. This is exactly the difference between people who stay broke and people who build wealth. Broke people optimize for consumption. They think about how to spend their money more efficiently. Wealthy people optimize for value creation. They think about how to generate more income by solving problems for others. Japan became obsessed with quality. They developed manufacturing techniques that produced better products than anyone else could make. They didn't compete on price initially because they couldn't. They were a destroyed nation with high shipping costs and no brand recognition, so they competed on value. They made things that worked better, lasted longer, and performed more reliably. By the 1960s, Made in Japan went from being a joke about cheap knockoffs to being a symbol of quality. Japanese cars weren't just cheaper than American cars, they were better. Japanese electronics weren't just adequate, they were superior. This reputation for quality commanded premium prices, which generated higher profits, which funded more investment in even higher quality. Here's the psychological principle that made this work. Japan played the long game when everyone expected them to play the short game. After getting bombed into oblivion, most people would have expected Japan to grab whatever short-term gains they could get. Instead, they invested in reputation, quality, and long-term customer relationships. This is what separates us people who build lasting wealth from people who stay in the financial struggle. Wealthy people are willing to defer gratification. They're willing to invest now for payoffs later. They're willing to build reputation and quality even when it costs more upfront because they understand that compound returns on reputation are massive. The third principle Japan mastered was something I call strategic imitation before innovation. And this one is going to challenge some of your assumptions about success. In the early post war years, Japan didn't try to invent everything from scratch. They studied what was working in other countries, particularly America, and they copied it. They sent engineers to American factories to learn the manufacturing techniques. They licensed technology from Western companies. They reverse engineered products to understand how they worked. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds like cheating. But here's what most people don't understand about how wealth actually gets built. Innovation is overrated. Execution is underrated. Japan didn't waste resources trying to reinvent wheels that already existed. They took proven concepts, adapted them to their situation, and executed them better than anyone else. They weren't ashamed to learn from others. They weren't too proud to admit that other people had figured out things they hadn't. This has massive implications for your personal finances. How much time do you spend trying to figure out wealth building from scratch versus studying what actually works for people who've already done it? How often do you ignore proven financial strategies because they seem boring or unoriginal? The Japanese would have thought that kind of thinking was insane. They saw Western wealth and said, "We want that. Let's figure out exactly how they did it and do it better." They weren't trying to be creative about building wealth. They were trying to be effective. By the late 1960s, Japan had absorbed enough knowledge from the West that they could start innovating on their own. But they only innovated after they had mastered the fundamentals. They didn't try to skip steps. They didn't try to find shortcuts. They put in the work to understand the basics, and then they built on top of that foundation. The fourth principle is the one that really ties everything together, and it's the one most people never talk about. Japan had what I call aligned incentives at every level of society. The Japanese government, the corporations, the workers, and the banks were all pointed in the same direction. Government policy supported export industries. Banks provided cheap capital to companies that were creating value. Workers accepted lower wages in exchange for job security and profit sharing. Companies reinvested profits instead of paying them out to shareholders. Everyone was playing a long-term cooperative game instead of a short-term competitive game. The workers didn't demand immediate wage increases because they understood that company growth would eventually benefit them. The companies didn't maximize short-term profits because they understood that reinvestment would create more value long-term. The government didn't try to extract maximum taxes because they understood that economic growth would eventually generate more tax revenue. This is the opposite of how most people approach their finances. Most people are playing a short-term game against themselves. They have competing priorities that sabotage each other. They want to save, but they also want to spend. They want to invest, but they also want lifestyle improvements now. They want long-term security, but they're not willing to sacrifice short-term comfort. Japan aligned every part of their system toward a single goal: economic growth that would benefit everyone over time. And because everyone was aligned, they could make sacrifices that would have been impossible otherwise. Here's the thing that should really make you think. Japan's transformation wasn't based on natural resources. They have almost no oil, no iron, no significant mineral deposits. They don't have more land than anyone else. They're actually one of the most resource-poor nations on Earth. Everything they built came from human effort, strategic thinking, and disciplined execution. They proved that the most important resource for building wealth isn't money. It's not natural resources. It's not even luck. It's the ability to think strategically, execute consistently, and defer gratification for future rewards. The lessons here for your personal finances are massive. First, Invest in your earning capacity before you invest in anything else. Your ability to generate income is your most valuable asset. Skills, education, and expertise compound just like money, but they compound faster and they can't be taken away from you. Second, focus on creating value for others, not on consuming for yourself. The path to wealth runs through solving problems for other people, not through spending money on yourself. Third, don't be too proud to learn from people who've already figured it out. Study what works, copy the fundamentals, master the basics before you try to get creative. Fourth, align your financial system so that all parts are working toward the same goal. Stop fighting yourself. Stop having competing priorities that sabotage each other. Get clear on what you want and point everything in that direction. Japan went from atomic bombs to the world's second largest economy in 30 years because they understood something that most people never figure out. Wealth isn't something you find or something that happens to you. Wealth is something you build through discipline, strategic, long term thinking. They didn't have advantages. They had disadvantages that would have crushed most nations, but they had a mindset that refused to accept their circumstances as permanent. The question you should be asking yourself right now is this: if a country that got nuked twice can become an economic superpower in 30 years, what's actually stopping you from transforming your own financial situation? The answer, if you're being honest, is probably the same things that would have stopped Japan if they'd let them. Short term thinking, consumption instead of creation, pride instead of learning, competing priorities instead of aligned action. Japan didn't wait until they could afford to invest in their future. They invested in their future so they could afford everything else. That's the mindset shift that separates like people who build wealth from people who stay stuck. Now stop watching videos about money and go build something.